All right, so hope you enjoyed the break. Our next invited speaker is Professor Andrea Halpern from Bucknell University in the US. Andrea finished her PhD at Stanford and now teaches in the Department of Psychology and the Neuroscience program at Bucknell. She researches how musicians and non-musicians understand, remember, and react to music, auditory imagery, learning and remembering music, and art in Alzheimer's disease, and why some people are bad singers. In her research, Andrea uses both experimental psychology and neuroscience techniques and has many publications in journals such as Cerebral Cortex and Music Perception, and funding from federal agencies and private foundations, including currently the Grammy Foundation. Thanks a lot, Andrea.
Okay, so let me share my screen. And are we sharing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for sticking with us. And I would like to talk to you about a topic that really hasn't come up so much, which is the role of aging in music psychology generally. So lots of older people consume music. I think you're probably quite aware of that. And many older people participate in music. Many of you have probably heard anecdotes of older or impaired people even uniquely preserving their musical skill. But I do have to point out that the research literature lags behind these well-known observations. I'd like to show you some data that I recently looked up. This shows the audience for classical music in the UK by I think some public opinion agency called the Audience Agency, that looked at almost 7,000 performances in 113 venues. I don't know how many people that comprised. And you can see the age breakdown for the audience. And you can see here that over almost 60% of the audience for at least classical music was over the age of 50. So again, high participation rate. Turning to some data from the United States, I have found some data from the National Humanities Council for the Arts and the Endowment for the Arts, excuse me, looking at the share of adults playing musical instrument from a survey in 2012. And we can see that although there's a high participation rate in young adults, probably they're in school, participation rate in playing is rather constant over the age span, even to the rather older age group of over 75. If we look at participating in singing, we again have a very constant participation of older adults in participation of music. So we have older adults as attendees and as participants. But if we look at the research literature, we can see some gaps. And I will say that I spoke about this when I gave my presidential talk for the Society for Music Perception and Cognition in 2012, doing some of the same searches, and absolutely nothing has changed. So I've had zero influence, but that's nothing new. What I did was I looked at the journal Psychology and Aging, the flagship journal in this field from the American Psychological Association. And I did a search of all articles published in its history, and I intersected that with the keyword music. I know that's not a perfect search strategy, but when I did that search, I found 12 articles only, and 4 of them were mine. I looked at another journal, quite different one, Journals of Gerontology B, a different publisher. Again, 2,500 articles in its publishing history, looked at the keyword music, and there was one article, it wasn't mine. I did the reverse search recently. I looked at the journal Music Perception, and that's, again, a leading journal in the field, and full disclosure, I'm an associate editor there. I looked up 1,127 articles on music perception and looked at the keyword aging, and I found only 4 articles, and one of those is mine. Now, I know I may have missed some, but I think this gives us an indication of some gaps in the literature. So what are we looking again at, though, some issues in cognitive aging? Let's talk a little bit about what are some generalities in the issues of cognitive aging. And as a generalization, we note that there are some sensory declines in hearing and in vision. More interestingly or relevant here is that even healthy aging, on average, there are great individual differences, involves some loss in fluid skills. By that I mean things like speed of processing, on average working memory capacity, encoding new information, not retrieval of old information, but encoding new information, and things like rapid strategy switches from task to task. So these dynamic, in the moment, high resource consuming skills tend to have some decline with aging, again with individual differences. At a neural level, we know that one of the hallmarks and one of the correlates of these fluid skill declines is reduced integrity of neural transmission. So we have some white matter declines that predict some of things like working memory loss. But let us not think that aging is only a story of decline. Au contraire, there's certainly lots of evidence for both maintenance and gain in healthy aging. For instance, simple short-term retention, just holding on to information for a few moments, seems very robust to healthy aging. Of course, we get gains throughout our lifespan. We gain in expertise. We gain in general knowledge, including, to at least some extent, learning how to learn. That is our metacognitive strategies, in addition to things like general wisdom and moral decision-making. One of the interesting issues that we see in aging is that healthy aging involves a series of compensatory skills. So for instance, one of the things we often see in individuals that maintain accuracy levels similar to younger adults is that they tend to slow down. So there's a compensation, which we can consider a loss as a gain as a function of loss, to put it in the words of some researchers. We also see, generally speaking, more different parts of the brain used to accomplish the same task. It's what's called de-differentiation. Again, it's a compensatory strategy. But what are we missing if we, though, don't put these literatures together? If we are kind of missing we have a research gap in our literature. And I would argue that we, of course, are missing some information about the basic science of aging with respect to our field. We can ask interesting questions about changes in basic cognitive, perceptual, neuroscience, and affective mechanisms. Particularly interesting is that it helps us with a bit of this nature-nurture issue if we look at individuals who have had many years of experience or specific training with the biological changes that come with aging, which may be a bit of a decline. So that helps frame some of those issues in basic science. Reaching outside our basic science areas, the more we know about issues in both healthy aging, we can talk about the educational strategies we use as older adults in many, many situations continue to further their education. And of course, we can look at rehabilitation strategies for individuals who may be suffering some cognitive decline if we know about healthy aging. And I would offer emotion as sort of a lens to focus on some of these issues. So I'd like to talk about three aspects of the intersection among aging, music, and emotion in my chat today. I'll talk about the issue of recognizing emotions in music, or what we sometimes call decoding. So how we recognize what the composer's intent was. So to give you some background, some studies find rather a lot of stability in this over healthy older age. Sometimes people find an older adult, OA's older adult disadvantage, especially for the processing of negative emotions, which we're coming back to. Some studies have suggested this might possibly be more stable in musicians, whether due to training, propensity, or both. We'll also talk a little bit about emotional response. So I can recognize that a piece of music is sad without feeling sad necessarily, but sometimes I'll feel sad. Here in other domains, we sometimes see a positivity effect. That is, we see an older adult privileging the processing of positive over negative emotions. So healthy, robust response to positive some less robust processing and negative, which some researchers and theorists have suggested is actually, again, a compensation that it allows older adults to better emotionally regulate. And I'll talk a little bit about aesthetic response, how we decide what it is that we like about a piece of music. And actually, I'll talk more about art than music because the art study is complete, the music one is in progress. Here the question is, might a lifetime of exposure actually lead to a gain in being faster and having more stable opinions? In that sense, a gain. I want to give you a caution. Whenever we talk about aging, of course, we have to recognize this is a correlational variable. Would that I could assign you randomly to an age group? Obviously, we can't. So we have to always keep that in mind. And because older adults have lived at a different time, this was mentioned in a prior talk, cohort effects are hard to control. Someone who's 80 years old today is not just 80 years old, but grew up in a different time. Again, we cannot control that. We just want to keep that in mind. So I first want to talk about a motion decoding study that was some unpublished work I did with a student. And what Sarah Ock and I did a few years ago is we had younger and older listeners listening to pieces associated with 4 emotions. These are pieces that have been validated in prior work from the French composer, of the French researcher Vieillard. And older and younger listeners heard pieces associated with 4 emotions, and they had to classify which emotion it was. So this. So was that sound shared?
Yes, it was
okay,
shared.
Thank you. So we asked people then to do a surprise recognition test, and we looked at age comparisons on the classification performance and the recognition performance. Not surprisingly, the older adults had worse memory than the younger adults. This is very, very typical. They interestingly had absolutely equal classification success. And by the way, we had put some pieces in to this set that were not easy to classify as sort of foils. So it wasn't that every piece was easy to classify. We made it a little bit harder, but everybody was equally successful and did rather well. But what we were actually quite interested in was sort of an individual difference. We wondered whether individuals who were better able to decode the emotion would also remember the pieces better. And here are the data. You can see that this is generally true for the decoding score as it went up, and this is the memory score here. Chance is 50%. And you can see there's a generally positive relationship between those, but it's particularly steep for the older adults. That is, more so for the older than younger adults. The better decoders also had better memory, which could mean that they were using this decoding as a scaffold for their memory. So that's kind of an interesting decoding point. Another sort of contextual scaffolding study I did again with a former student back in 2011 looked at emotional information as a scaffold for remembering tunes. And here we had unfamiliar tunes paired with some semantic information, a patriotic label, a neutral fact. This tune, for instance, is played during military exercises. And then we had an emotional fact that was positive or negative. This tune is played during military funerals, so that was matched with the neutral. We then had an unexpected tune recognition task. They had 1 or 3 presentations of these, although that's not of great interest here. Here are the data for the young adults, and here are the data for the older adults. Now, once again, we see that younger adults did much better than the older adults. This is not surprising, nor is that 3 presentations are better than 1. Not surprising. What was interesting is that the context, that is the difference in these 3 conditions, was not making any difference for the younger adults. I will note that this is not an easy task for the 1 presentation. D prime is only about 1, which is what I typically find. But even in the easier condition, where you had seen it 3 times, there was no difference for the younger. But interestingly enough, for the older adults, they got their memory performance suffered when there was a neutral fact, as if that was a distraction. But notice, when the fact was emotional, it returned memory to baseline. So again, it may be that our older adults are using the emotion detected in this case, the semantic information, and attaching it to the music to help their memory. We also have, again, returning to some of the themes we've had from some prior speakers, and I'm going to talk about some work I've done both with two of our other speakers, Marcus Pierce and Joy Bhattacharya. We have talked about emotion as being in the family, in sort of the expectation family, or expectation as an emotion. And as we've heard before, music does obey implicit rules. So we know that depending on your musical tradition, there are certain, it's not an absolute given, but we have certain probabilities about what is going to follow what. And of course, in a tonal system, some notes are more likely to follow than other notes, the same thing with chords and so forth. And as we've heard before, a violation of this expectation can induce a surprise response because the expectation, of course, is not fulfilled. That surprise can be pleasant or unpleasant depending on context. And again, we've heard about some context in some other of the presentations. What we asked in this study was whether experience in the sense of being an older adult might in fact mediate this kind of this sort of surprise response. We wondered whether older adults, and these are non-musicians, so we're setting aside specific musical training, would older adults, given their decades-long more exposure to music, would generate stronger expectations for what's going to come at the end of a melody. We had behavioral data, and we also had the older adults undergo an EEG study. So for this, we had a composer generate unfamiliar 8-note melodies that were newly composed for this research, and the composer used her intuition so that the last note either was a very expected ending, such as this, so the last note is quite expected. So listen to it again. Or unexpected. So she used her intuition for this, the same stem, a different ending note. These were not out of tune in the sense they were not mistuned. They were in the scale. They were just unexpected. In order to validate these, we actually had two verifications in addition to the composer's intuition. We did a behavioral rating test with some judges. They used a 3-point scale to tell us whether the last note was a good, so-so, or poor ending. And as expected, the unexpected melody got lower ratings on goodness than the expected melodies. That was a highly significant difference. And then we also used idiom, courtesy of Marcus, to actually model those melodies. And we looked at the note expectancy 1 over information content. And we found that the expected melodies, the last note was conveying 4.66 bits more expected, and the unexpected were conveying a lot more information, much more unexpected. So we have both a computational and a judgment verification in addition to intuition. Looking in the study, the participants listened to each melody, made a rating, and the ratings were actually on a 4-point scale. 1 was a very good ending, 4 was a very bad ending, and just like the prediction, we had expected melodies got more good ratings than the bad, but notice here there was absolutely no age difference. The younger adults and the older adults actually had the identical performance. So behaviorally, they were looking absolutely the same. And we also looked at the conformity of these ratings to the idiom model, and both groups gave a very good fit to the model, a little bit higher in the younger than the older, but both quite good fits. So that is, as a side note, I think the first time that the idiom model was used with data from older adults, and it behaved quite well. Looking at the average evoked potentials, we can see this is a bit complicated, but the notation here is that the older adults, here called mature, were in the solid lines and the younger adults in the dashed lines. The unexpected is in the red and the expected is in the blue. We note this is a little bit hard to detect, but we do actually have some typical responses. We have an N1, sort of an early onset response, and then we have two later responses we looked at, the positive 200 and the late positive component. Both on this graph, positive is going up. And we can see, even with the sort of naked eye, that we have larger responses of the older than the younger adults, and some larger response of the expected over the unexpected over the expected. But let's sort of break this down a bit. So if we look at the scalp maps, we see, and here we have a graph in looking at the amount of activation. We have both groups looking very similar for the early response. The expected was a little bit, we have an expectation response here, so more negative response for the unexpected. Quite similar in our groups. So we're having this early response similar in the age groups. If we go to the later window, time window, at 200 milliseconds past the signal, we begin seeing a divergence in the groups. We have not really much of an expectation response anymore, but we're getting a larger response in our older adults compared to our younger adults. And we can see that in the heat maps here. We have more response of our older than younger adults, and also notice that they are quite diffuse across the electrodes. If we look at the latest window we looked at, the late positive component, we see a similar response. We have the older adults having a larger response than the younger adults, and we can see, again, a more diffuse response over more electrodes. These late responses are not giving the expected versus unexpected. So we have, again, a suggestion that we have age-related differences in the detection of expectation viewing this as a decoding responses, and in some cases, at least in some respects, kind of stronger in our older adults for both the last note for both expected and unexpected, and using more of the brain in that compensation dedifferentiation model. What about emotional reactions to music? So this is a study that I did with Marcus, and what we asked was whether we could find age differences in the profile of emotional response. That is, how a piece of music makes you feel. And going on that earlier discussions about positivity effect, we wondered whether older people might in fact have a lesser response to sad music, consider it more positive than the younger adults. That would be consistent with a positivity effect. We used validated, again, film music excerpts. So this was actual orchestral introductions. And these were rated on liking, familiarity, and the Geneva Emotion Scale, the GEMS-9, a shortened scale. This is a validated scale in which you make 9 ratings for each piece of music on these dimensions: wonder, transcendence, power, tenderness, nostalgia, peacefulness, joyful activation, sadness, and tension. So you had these ratings: liking, familiarity, and the GEMS-9. This was how it made you feel. Admittedly, this isn't a lab study, but these are pieces of film music, and they are composed to try to induce emotion. So we had some hopes this would induce changes. Now, first of all, there was no age differences in the liking. Everybody liked them similarly, and this was a really super group of older adults. There was actually no working memory span difference in our older adults and our younger adults. So these were very cognitively high elite group of our older adults. The excerpts were somewhat more familiar to the younger adults, but that didn't seem to really change anything when we looked at the main results. So when we looked at the GEMS scale, we did a factor analysis, and we found that the 9 GEMS factors actually cohered into 3 factors, which factor 1 we called arousal. So we had high loading on tenderness, nostalgia, and peace, and negative loadings on tension. We called factor 2 animacy, and this had high loadings on wonder, transcendence, and power, feeling powerful. And Factor 3 was our old friend valence. So this is sort of a sanity check, which loaded positively on joy and negatively on sadness. The results for the different participants looked as follows. Again, a bit busy, but let me take you through it. Here we have factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, arousal, animacy, and valence. And the different types of music are color-coded: blue for fearful, red for happy, green for sad, and purple for tenderness. And at first glance, if you just look at this grossly, I think the first thing you might see is that overall, there was a fairly similar pattern. There were not really strange or odd differences. Conservation of this induction, even though this is in a laboratory setting, et cetera, and only 1 minute of music. But if we look more closely, we see some age differences. So generally speaking, older adults have somewhat less differentiation. They're compressing the scale, particularly if we look at factor 2 of animacy, where our young adults have some positive and maybe one negative. The older adults are kind of more on the negative loadings on all of these. So they're overall a less differentiation. We also, though, have that some evidence, in fact, it's not strong evidence, but weak evidence for a positivity effect. I want to point out that, as predicted, our older adults have less of a sad music. Sad music was much less sad for our older adults compared to our young adults. Not much difference on the happy music. Happy music is pretty much equally happy for both groups, making them happy, but older adults report being less sad to the sad music compared to the young adults. So that is consistent with the positivity effect. So our interim summary is that healthy seniors overall seem to detect the emotional message as intended. We see that from decoding and expectation ratings. There are some qualitative differences. Decoding supports memory more in older adults. As a compensation, broader and stronger neural response to tune endings in our older adults. These, again, could be kind of scaffolds to support these other more cognitively demanding tasks. Less differentiated reported reaction, even though this could not be attributed to working memory differences, nor to liking. Those were controlled. And modest support for the positivity effect. I cannot exclude, of course, that older adults might be using the reporting scale differently, and that's something we may talk about in the discussion panel. So my final topic is on aesthetic appraisal. How do we decide what we like? Yeah, no accounting for taste, huh? Well, many people have thought about this, acknowledge, and I think you would too, that we need to have intact perceptual skills. We have to see or hear the piece of art. We have to have cognitive analysis. That is, art is also symbolic. And we have our emotional reaction. We know from lots of work that we like things the more we're familiar with them. Familiarity breeds liking. And of course, there may be inexplicable other factors, which I am not going to discuss. I'd like to tell you a little bit about a study I did that looked at appreciation for artworks. It was called I Know What I Like, back in 2008. We had healthy older adults, and here we had early stage Alzheimer's patients. The patients were given a gold standard diagnosis by behavioral neurology unit. This is not easy to do, to get the highest possible diagnosis. And of course, in life, we can only give a diagnosis of probable Alzheimer's. We excluded comorbidities. We had matched control participants by age and educational level. And we had 2 experiments with pretty healthy samples. I'll be talking to you about experiment 2, which had the memory component. There were no professional artists in the group. We had 3 styles of painting: representational, what I call quasi-representational. So this painting by Picasso is called Weeping Woman. You can tell it's a weeping woman, but it's not a realistic style, and we had abstract. Your basic task was you got postcards with each of these, and you sorted them in your preference order from most preferred to least preferred in each of those groupings. In session 1, you got some neuropsych testing. You had an art preference and a control task. 2 weeks later, you came back, and unexpectedly, you got a surprise recognition memory where you got 16 cards and you had to tell me the 8 which you had seen 2 weeks previous. And then we repeated the art preference task. The way we measured preference stability is on a 0 to 4 scale, in which a 0 would mean that you did not change your preferences at all. 4 meant that you changed all possible rank orders. So we can see that these scores under 2 were fairly stable preferences. On average, they were fairly stable, a little bit less stable for the abstract.
Yep, all is good.
Okay, sorry. We have fairly stable preferences. As we see, no group difference. There was no correlation with the Alzheimer's scores with neuropsych, memory, naming, or depression scale. Except overall dementia rating was a little bit less stable, especially for the quasi. But what's particularly also interesting, this was not due to particular items being liked or hated. I did an item analysis, and it wasn't that there was one thing that everybody liked. Everybody had different preferences. It's just that you were stable, whether you had dementia or not. And what's also interesting is that if we look at the memory scores, where chance is 50%, there was no difference in the art style. Of course, the normal control was superior to the Alzheimer's, but I want to point out that the Alzheimer's explicit memory score was a chance. On average, they were not remembering the paintings at all, and there was no correlation of their Alzheimer's patients' memory scores with their change score. So this is giving us some insight into aesthetic judgment, but not requiring the kind of memory that's impaired in early stage Alzheimer's. I've done a replication with frontotemporal dementia, and in fact, we found the same thing. It was fairly stable and uncorrelated with naming ability, even though they have terrible naming. So we think this gives an independence of cognition and aesthetic response, not based on cognitive analysis or labeling or conscious memory. How about music? This is in progress. It's taking a long time to get it done with music. It's much more technically demanding. We're using jazz and classical ear string music, and we're adding an implicit memory task of liking. More liking of the melody the second time means that you've encoded it, whether you realize it or not. So I'm going to try this in music, and we'll see if it generalizes. And finally, I'm looking at speed of judgments, aesthetic judgment. In a study I did with Emery Schubert, valence, arousal, and emotionality, we looked at people making these as continuous judgment. And we found that people could make these judgments in real time. This is a Beethoven, a Mozart, and a Tchaikovsky piece, even in imagined contexts. So one of those lines is heard, one of those lines is imagined. They look the same. So people can make judgments of emotionality in real time. They can also make judgments of liking. In a study that's in preparation with a group based at NYU, we found that people's liking for tunes reaches asymptote very quickly. And the slope of that judgment, how quickly you get to that asymptote for liked music, actually correlates with deactivation of the default mode network. So in progress, I have a study at Durham University with Thomas Erala and a grad student, Annelise McAuliffe-Brumeau. And we're looking at age differences. And we wanted to know whether age-related slowing might involve a shallower time to decide on your final decision, or whether a lifetime of taste development might involve a steeper slope. You know what you like and you get to it more quickly. Of course, both could be true, in which case we'd see no difference, or maybe we see no difference for other reasons, but we're hoping that doesn't happen. We're giving 30-second excerpts of unfamiliar jazz. We're giving liking ratings every 5 seconds to a visual prompt. And then you start at 0, and then you rate from -5 to +5 how much you like the music. And it looks something like this. So, okay, so moving on. So you can see what that's like, and that interface is moving well. Unfortunately, we only had a chance to test 6 young adults and 1 older adult before the time of COVID. So I only have some preliminary results, but here we have the 7 participants. The 1 older adult is in the pink, and these are all the different jazz pieces. And I think we have some proof of concept that the pieces are differing in the general patterns. people are differing, but we're seeing preliminary evidence that people are kind of getting to an asymptote. They don't tend to jag it all around. If you really like step forward, or you really, you kind of think it's kind of okay, you sort of get to that and you sort of stay. And so here we're kind of optimistic that we'll be able to capture these slope, at least for the first, probably using the first 3 points, and to see if our conjectures are correct. We had some comments from our participants about why they were changing their ratings, and we saw some similarity. Repetition, people don't really like, or if it's weird. We don't like things that stay the same, or if it has no discernible tune. We do like things that are evolving, changing. And so far, our one older adult had somewhat similar responses to our 2 younger, so we'll keep you posted. So our conclusion is that episodic memory for music and art declines as with other material in older age. It is not uniquely preserved. Emotion processing is often preserved, sometimes enhanced, depending on interpretation of some of the studies, particularly if it depends on your experience. We have less differentiated responding, but similar relationships of emotions across age. That is, we don't have a fundamental change in the palette of emotions. I think emotional context may serve as a scaffold for all of us, but the more we age, it may serve as more of a scaffold, as per that sort of depiction there. So I'd like to thank some of my funders, the Leverhulme Trust, the James McKean Cattell Fund, many student researchers, Experimental Psychology Society, the main organizers that you've already met. And I leave you with a lovely picture of older and younger bassoon players making beautiful music together. So I know, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I think I'm actually pretty much on time. So I will end that show and stop sharing, I guess, and see if we have any questions.
Right. So hello, thanks for the presentation. Just a second, I need to make some adjustment on my recording side. I'll be with you in a second. All right, fantastic. So, well, we had to have some technical difficulties at some point.
So sorry.
and it happened to be you. So thankfully, audience is also patient, and yeah, I think it is understandable to have some technical difficulties. All right, so just a few questions. What do you know, or what is known about aging and absolute pitch?
Oh, well, that's a little outside of my area here. Though what little I know, I don't have absolute pitch, so of course, I don't think it's terribly important. No, just kidding. Those of us who don't have it, we can't quite appreciate it. The one thing I know that I've heard is that there are some pitch mapping changes over time. So there have been, I think these are anecdotal, I don't know if they generalize, but I know some people have reported who have absolute pitch. I think Jan Sundberg might be one of them. That they have reported, in fact, some, their map gets sharper with age, interestingly enough. So I'm not quite sure why, and I don't know if that generalizes, but I've heard a few anecdotal reports about that.
Thanks. About the experiment, about expectations. Given that the differences between young adult and old adults did not, or almost, interact with the expectedness of the tune, what is your guess about the cause of these differences, but no difference for earlier components like the N1?
Yeah, that's something that we kind of talked about. Of course, N1 is a more of a sort of immediate onset, kind of onset response, the sort of, if you will, what is that? And then the later responses is, oh, I think I know what it is. At least particularly by the time you get to the late positive component, you're well into the window in which people can have conscious responses. So we've associated the LPC with a little bit of a more conscious response. So it may be that the again, this is all speculation, but it may be that whatever the older adults have developed from the point of view of getting you, paying more attention, if you will, to how melodies unfold, they may be employing more of that conscious strategy. We don't see it at that early end response is well below the level of awareness. So that seems to be a dissociation between the less conscious and the more conscious response.
Does your research suggest particular ways to engage with older adults through music? Do you think to better improve their well-being, for example?
Yes, none of the studies that I talked about, of course, actually looked at well-being, but the first, as a basic scientist, not a clinical scientist, I like to say that we want to inform our clinical colleagues about the basic mechanisms and so forth. And I think we have some optimistic information from these sorts of studies that there's no reason to think that healthy older adults and even people with early stage, the two kinds of dementias that I've looked at, it looks like in the general sense of appreciate, we're getting our older adults as appreciative, and sometimes more appreciative, if you will, of the music. And in the case that I had more information on the art, I think we can kind of put them together. So there should be some great optimism to say that this mode of communication is fairly robust. And I think it's quite interesting that this was in the art projects was in the complete absence of explicit memory for these paintings. Okay. And yet the stability was maintained as if they may have been remembered at an implicit level. The music study will ask implicit, but to the extent we're sort of computing, drawing from what we like from our lifetime and melding it with what we're seeing now, those circuits seem to be very robust. And it's, I think, gives entree into, yes, I think we can have some confidence in exposure to the arts will be communicating to people even with cognitive disabilities.
Okay, fantastic. How decoding emotions interacts with cognitive load? Are decoding emotional sounds more demanding and time-consuming in processing compared to neutral sounds?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer to that because it's very hard to present music that has no emotion in it. I've had to construct those for various studies, and that can be kind of difficult to present music that conveys nothing. So I'll just set that as a side. But I think for that, what you would probably want to do is maybe add some time to respond, which we didn't really have that as a component, maybe with some cognitive load, although you'd want to control tasks to make sure that the older adults aren't impaired in everything equally when you give cognitive load. So you have to be, as an earlier speaker said, very concerned about our control tasks, both from the point of view stimuli and of task. But I think there could be two sides to that coin. On the one hand, decoding, depending on how you ask people to do it, the task itself could require some cognitive load. Oh, I have to check off all 9 of these boxes. On the other hand, and relating that to perhaps the EEG study, the recognition that there is emotion in there may be very implicit. It's kind of hard to turn that off. Okay, don't think of the emotion of that piece of music. Is probably more cognitively demanding, I would guess, inhibition than actually doing it. So those would be, I think, a 2 sides of the coin kind of answer.
Okay, regarding Halpern and O'Connor studies with Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia patients, what would you expect if you had also used implicit memory tests? Could the aesthetically more liked ones be better remembered implicitly, even though we know that typically there is no level of processing effect for implicit memory?
Yes, and that is why we're adding, and I kind of regret not having done an implicit task. It was if any of you've worked with clinical populations, it took quite a while to get that study all together. And in retrospect, yes, we would have liked to have had an implicit study, and that's why we're including it in the music study. So I think, again, a couple of things could be going on. Some studies show relative preservation of implicit memory when explicit is impaired, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you really find that the encoding is quite impaired. So I did a prior study with music, not in this context of aesthetic, but just pure memory, an earlier study with O'Connor. And you heard the melodies twice, and there was no preservation of implicit memory for our Alzheimer's patients in that case. I think other people have replicated that, and if you present more than twice, you can find it. But we found no evidence. So I think I'm not confident we're going to get implicit coding, but we're going to try, particularly as they're not going to hear them they're only going to be hearing them, I think, twice. And we know encoding for music is more difficult than for art. So I'm not confident we're going to see implicit memory, but I want to put that in to look at it. And it's, I think, a little bit of an oversimplification to say that implicit memory encoding is preserved. Encoding is a very early victim in Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia.
Thank you. Maybe two more questions. So what are your thoughts on how music of our youth shapes liking, expectation, emotion, etc. In these studies? In other words, to what degree does a generation raised on the Beach Boys have different perceptions regarding emotion than a generation raised on the Backstreet Boys? How can that be assessed?
No, the Beatles are the best. Of course, if I had a poll here, I would take a poll right now. Yes, that's why the selection of materials is very tricky, because we know there are generational and cohort effects, and I began with that idea of the cohort, and I spend quite a bit of time, because I want to control that in these studies, is trying to find pieces that kind of go across the generations. And interestingly, in two separate studies, we've settled on a kind of big band tonal jazz as something that both generations seem to be okay with, and I don't use lyrics, partly for that reason. So that's a very, very challenging question. And we, in the Ripple study, for instance, which was all young adults, there was some electronica. We're not using that. And that's why in the music study, after long pilot work, we settled on kind of standard classical string music and also, again, kind of tonal jazz, not avant-garde jazz. So it's definitely a question that we always have to keep in mind if we're not interested in the cohort, but if we are, then of course we want to manipulate it.
Okay. Any suggestions about the influence of cognitive reserve in the result about the processing of memory versus emotion across aging?
I'm not quite sure I understand that, except I want to try to avoid being circular. I don't want to say because emotional processing is more robust that by ipso facto that means that requires less cognitive reserve. We'd have to have an independent measure of that, which we don't really have. So we have to be a little bit careful. It's a hypothesis that we could test, that the emotional decoding may require less cognitive reserve, but for that, we would want to have something independent. If you look at the EEG study on the expectation, we saw that the older adults were using quite a lot of brain power, if you will, on those expectancies. So that would go a little bit against at not requiring cognitive reserve, but we didn't have another task in that same paradigm. So I can't fully say. It's a great question, and you'd have to think carefully about an independent measure of cognitive reserve.
All right, fantastic. So I guess that is it. We have to finish the talk here. And once again, thanks, Andrea, for your talk.
Apologies again, I don't know what happened.
Absolutely fine. All right, so we will come back in about 30 seconds for our next talk. Thank you.